We've been in the book of Luke for a while now, and it feels like every week we come and we tell you, man, the book of Luke is amazing. We're learning so many good things and new things, and it's true again this week. But this week I was reminded of the fact that the Gospel of Luke it's doing something broadly that we need to be mindful of as we look every week into these specific things that the Bible is teaching us. And broadly, what the Gospel of Luke is doing, it is telling us, it's a public announcement of something that has happened. The book of Luke is a public announcement of something that has happened, namely in the person of Jesus and the mission of Jesus, that as a result of what's happened, now the whole world is a different place. And you and you and you and me and everybody in the whole world can experience this new thing that is happening. They can experience it for themselves and enter into this new world called the kingdom of God. So it's a pronouncement of good news. And over the past few weeks, we've been looking at little things here and there throughout the teachings, whether it's money or talking about hell or emotions. And all of these things are like the ethic of the kingdom, the principles that the kingdom lives by. But I think today what's so beautiful is we're going to be reminded not that this kingdom is just a kingdom of ethics or this kingdom is just a kingdom of principles, but that there is an invitation to participate in this kingdom no matter where you find yourself in life. And I think this is so important because sometimes we can start to make up a story about God, and that story might not have anything to do with the God that is portrayed in the Bible. So there's a quote by a guy named A.W. Tozer. It's a pretty famous quote, and here's what he says. Tozer says, "What a person thinks about when they think about God is the most important thing about that person." So what you think about when you think about God is the most important thing about you. If you think God's a vending machine, that's going to affect you. If he's Santa Claus, which is basically a vending machine, but like a person, that's going to affect you. If you think he's like that mad coach who's just disappointed all the time with the clipboard, that's going to affect you. If he's a distant father, that's going to affect you. If he's just a deity up there legislating morality, that is going to affect you. But I started thinking about that quote, and that quote has more to do with us than it has to do with God. So as I looked at Luke 15, here's what I thought. Here's my question. Not just what do you think about when you think about God, but what do you think God thinks about you when God thinks about you? So not just what do you think about when you think about God, but what do you think about when you think about what God thinks about when God thinks about you? Did you catch all that? Because maybe more importantly than what you think about when you think about God is what you think about when you think about what God thinks about you. That's a significant thing. Here's why. I think most of us, if we're honest, whether you have a church background or not, if you're honest, if you think there is a God, you probably think he takes his cues from you. Here's what I mean. If you're having a good day, God is pleased with you. You got up early, you went to the gym, you came home and like made coffee for all of your roommates, and then you're like reading the Bible when your roommates wake up, and you're like, hey, welcome to the morning. I'm just in the Word. Here's some coffee. It's not even 8 a.m. and you're like, Lord, I don't know if you're watching, but I am killing it today. And then you like go to class early, you turn in your homework, you're just having a great time. Like if you have kids, like you haven't yelled at your kids, you're not hurting anybody, you're like not gossiping about your roommates. You have just a great day and you get home and you're like, man, I don't want to watch TV tonight. Like I'm going to read the Bible twice today. Whoa. As if that's possible. Crazy. And so then you're like reading the Bible at night and you like close the Bible right as you're getting sleepy. You're like, Lord, you've probably never been more happy with me than today because you take your cues from me, God, and I had a good day. Therefore, you love me. I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow you wake up, you sleep in, you have a terribly rushed morning, you eat leftover calzone for breakfast on your way to class, because that's how messed up your day is. You're late to all your classes, you forgot all your assignments, you didn't have coffee at all, you're hungry all day because that calzone made you feel weird. And so essentially you've gone through the day with no connection to God, no caffeine, weird breakfast. You've been mean to all your roommates. You're texting nasty things to one another about the girl you don't like in your house. And you're doing all this stuff. And then you get into bed that night and you see your Bible from the night before and you're like, oh, I'm a Christian. Maybe, right? And then you start to think to yourself, Lord, I hope that you didn't look in on me today. Because there's no way you're happy with me today. Because God, you take your cues from me, and if I'm having a good day, then you like me. But if I'm having a bad day, God, don't look at me. I think a lot of us base our relationship with God on some random equation that we make up. Like if I'm good enough and kind enough, then God, you got to answer my prayers. And if I can figure out how to get rid of that sin in my life, then Lord, you owe me. And God, if I can be nice enough, then you're going to pay me back. And essentially it's this relationship of, God, I'm going to do something and then you're going to do something in response to what I do. And God, I'll do it, then you'll move, right? I'll do it and then you'll move. Or sometimes if God's not doing it the way you like, you just say, forget it, God, I'll do it by myself. And you can just watch. And the beautiful thing is Jesus knows this about us. And he wants to come to his people and he wants to say, hey, you guys know what? I know what God thinks about when God thinks about you. And that's what's happening in Luke chapter 15. He goes, there's a lot of stories out there. Let me tell you a story to clarify once and for all what God thinks about when God thinks about you. And here's what happened in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 1. This message that he's going to give and this parable he's going to give is a pretty well-known parable, but it's going to blow some people away. So starting in verse 1, it says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. We fly past that verse sometimes. Tax collectors and sinners, they're all gathered around to hear Jesus. You never had to pressure people to go to church if Jesus was preaching. You never had a hard time inviting your friends to church if Jesus was preaching. If you're here and you don't like church that much and you're not sure how you feel about this, look, that's fine. I don't resonate and you, that whole thing, we can talk about later. But I know this. If you met Jesus, you would like him. And he would like you. That is true of his whole entire life. From the homeless person to the king, Jesus' relational range was unparalleled. He met everyone right where they are, and everyone loved him. And something is happening in the story of Jesus that is so beautiful. It's attracting all kinds of people from all kinds of background. And you would think that's good news. You would think that's great news. But in verse 2, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the super religious people of the day, they muttered to themselves or to those around them, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. So these guys who are very religious, they look at Jesus and they go, man, we believe that maybe you're from God. The story is that you're from God. So here's our question to you, Jesus. If you really are from God, how could you like these people who are so far from God? If you're really from God, there's no way you could like these people who are so far from God. You might be God-like. How in the world do you like all these people who are nothing like God? And so the scripture says Jesus looks at the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and he goes, hey, let me tell you a story. And this story is going to help us clarify what we should think about when we think about what God thinks about us. And here it is. The first story, he tells 3 in a row, to the sinners and the tax collectors and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. The first story is about a man, a shepherd, who has 100 sheep, and one of the sheep run away. And in the story, the shepherd leaves the 99 sheep and he runs and he gets the one sheep who's been lost and he grabs him and he brings him back to the herd where he is now found. What was lost is now found. And they throw a party for the sheep that was gone but is now back. And so far, there's nothing controversial about the story. They're like, hey, sinners and tax collectors, you guys cool with that story? They're like, yeah, my cousin's a shepherd. That really happened one time. That's totally cool. What about you, Pharisees? You know, teachers of the law, you cool with that story? They're like, yeah, that story's fine. That's true. I know that guy's cousin. Yeah, it is true. He's a shepherd. Yeah, it's great. Okay, cool. Next story. There's a woman who has a collection of coins, very valuable coins. She loses one of her coins. It's a huge deal. This is a huge loss. So she calls people over. They're searching for the coin. They clean out the whole house. And finally, they find this very valuable coin, and they have it back in the collection. This woman has the value of the coin back in her possession. What was lost has been found, and there's a celebration. A massive party breaks out. Hey, Pharisees, teachers of the law, you guys cool with that story? They're like, yeah, I'm cool with that story. That happened to my wife last week. Really true thing. Like she found the coin that was missing. Cool. Okay, sinners and tax collectors, you guys cool with that? Yeah, same thing happens with me. Hey, ladies, you cool with the story? Yeah, it really did happen last week. Okay, cool. Nothing so far is controversial. A sheep has been found. A coin has been found. Great. But in verse 11, it turns. And then Jesus said to them, there was a man who had 2 sons. Now, if you have any church background or really just any, even cultural journalism uses the terminology of the prodigal son. So if you have any background in this, you know where this story is going. But just for a moment, pretend you didn't know where the story was going. Just for a moment, put yourself in their perspective. They've never heard this story. Jesus makes up the story. It's a parable, and it's intended to illustrate something. So just for a moment, feel the tension and the emotion of the story. Jesus says, now there's a man with 2 sons. And they're like, 2 sons? That's new. That's different. You said sheep. You said coin. We're all cool. Tell us more about the sons. A man has 2 sons. Now listen, this is a parable. This is a made-up story. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to embellish a little bit on this parable. I do not suggest you should embellish on the word of God in other places because that's like called heresy. But I'm embellishing on a parable, so relax, okay? Because this is a made-up story. It didn't really happen. Or did it? No, it didn't, okay? It's a made-up story. There's a man with 2 sons. And the younger son goes to his father, and he essentially says, I'm embellishing a little, but he essentially says, Father, you are incredibly rich. You have lots of money, lots of animals, lots of land, lots of things that are coming in your estate. And one day, a major portion of that estate is coming to me, and I too will be rich, and I too will have all the stuff. Problem is, Dad, you are taking too long to die. And because you're not dying, I'm not getting my stuff, and I have to keep here working with you, and I would rather have stuff than work for you. So basically, Dad, could you give me my portion of my inheritance right now? I know it's complicated with the land and the sheep and the goats and the house, whatever. I don't care about all that. I want my portion of the estate right now. He is functionally telling his father, Father, I wish you were dead. You're better off dead to me. And even the Pharisees, or even the sinners and the tax collectors had to be thinking to themselves, man, that is bold. Like, I sell taxes. I wouldn't do that to my dad. Right? Like, they feel this story like, man, that is bold. And probably a lot of people were like, oh, that son just said, hey, Dad, I wish you were dead. Watch this. Like, the dad's going to kill the son. Hey, older brother, you're in luck. I killed your other brother today. You're getting all the money. Right? You think that's maybe where this story is going, but instead it takes a turn. And the father says, all right, I'll give you all that's yours. So like, really? The father's going to give him all that's his? Yeah, so he gives him all that's his. And the Bible says a couple days later, the younger son took all of the new possession that was his, and he went off to a far country, and he spent his possessions on what the Bible calls wild living. That's PG-13. Your translations may say reckless living. If any of you are in the collegiate environment, I do not have to exaggerate or illustrate what this looks like for you. You know what this looks like, right? A weekend on Colorado Street in Pullman is what this guy spent his living on. Too much? You're with me. You're like, oh, the Bible makes sense now. I got you. Okay, cool. Yeah, all right. He spends his money on wild living. This makes sense, because if you think Colorado Street, man, like, this makes so much sense when you see where the story's going. And it turns out that lifestyle doesn't satisfy. And it's fun for a little while, but it doesn't work. A famine actually hits the land where the younger son is, and he gets hired by this other guy. And the only job this other guy has is to feed pigs. And in the Jewish world, that would have been the worst job imaginable because pigs were considered unclean. And the younger son now finds himself feeding pigs for a living. And he's so hungry and he's so thirsty, he longs to eat the pig food, but the other workers won't even let him eat the pig food. And everyone in the crowd must have heard this story like, yeah, that serves him right. He should have never treated his dad that way. That guy's the worst. I'm so glad he's down there with the pigs. Let him struggle to death. Let him deal with that. He deserves that kind of punishment. That's what the crowd might have been feeling. But something happens in verse 17. It says this: when he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. Now, this is where the crowd gets uncomfortable. Because they go, hey, hang on a second. Like, you told us a story of a sheep being lost and found, and now there's a coin that's lost and found. Hey, real quick, Jesus, this better not be a lost and found story. There's no way that kid who did that to his dad could be lost and found. There's no way that could happen. And the sinners and the tax collectors had to be thinking like, hey, we're smart enough to recognize if there's two sons and one of the sons is going out and sinning like this, that's probably us. Like we're probably that son in your made up story, Jesus. And there's no way this is a lost and found story. This has to be a story of the son going back to the father and being disowned and being judged and being punished for all the sin in his life. And so maybe the sinners and the tax collectors in the story are like, okay, you set us up with the sheep and the coin, but we know what's coming. Okay, this is the judgment part, right? This is where you tell us God is disappointed and is going to disown us. And there's real tension in the story. And the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they're saying, absolutely, tell him what he's done, disown him, let's bring this thing to a place of judgment. But in verse 20, again, remember, pretend like you don't know the story. The son is rehearsing a speech in his head, and he's headed home. In verse 20, he says, he returned home to his father. And while he was still a long way off, apparently his father's going to the front porch and looking for him every day. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. And filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, he embraced him, and he kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against both heaven and you. I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. But his father said to his servants, quick, totally ignores the speech his son just gave. Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet and kill the fattened calf. You know the calf we've been like getting super fat for the great party that we were waiting on? Well, this day has come. The party is here. We must celebrate with a feast. For the son of mine was dead and he has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. So the party began. The younger son was going to beg his father to be a servant. And in an instant, the father reinstated him as a son. This is an absolute scandal. How in the world could a son who disowned his father and went out and spent his possessions on wild living, how in the world, without earning, without doing, without repenting, without all these things, how in the world is he reinstated as a son when all he ever wanted was just to be a servant again? This would have been an audible gasp in the crowd. The Pharisees would have said, there's no way this could be a lost and found story. But the story says, while he was still a long way off, the father saw him. What do you think about when you think about what God thinks about you? The father saw him. And what did the father feel when he saw him? Love and compassion. Love and compassion. The father's heart broke for the son, longed for the son, probably every day went out on the porch and hoped and prayed that today would be the day when the son comes home. And finally he sees him in the distance. Is that my son? Is that just some guy traveling? And then he realizes it is his son. And shamelessly, pulls up his robe and takes off running down the road to catch his son, tackles the son, starts kissing the son. The son gives the speech. The father completely rejects the speech, tells the servant, put on the ring that says to everybody, this is my son. Put the sandals on his feet. He's not a servant. My son is back. Kill the fattened calf. Let's throw a party. My son is back. Do you believe when God looks at you, he sees you and has love and compassion? Or do you think that when God looks at you on that bad day, or let's be real, when God looks at you right after the sin that you just committed, the walk home after the sin you've committed, closing your computer after the sin you've committed, going too far after the sin you've committed, drinking too much, saying too much, stealing, cheating, lying, whatever it is, the worst of the worst of the worst, when you find yourself in the sin, in the darkness, in the brokenness, in that moment, do you realize that your Father looks at you and has love and compassion? And if the enemy or if yourself is telling you any other story than God looks at you and has love and compassion, that is not the biblical story of what God thinks about when God thinks about you. If you think that God does not look at you and have love and compassion in any moment of your life, then you do not understand the heart of your Father. The heart of your Father is love and compassion. Instant restoration to sonship. Not, okay, son, I'm glad you're back, but you got a lot of stuff to do to earn your way back in the family. No, instant restoration. Because the Father's heart had love and it had compassion. Do you believe that that's what God thinks about when God thinks about you? Do you go to the Father as if that's what he thinks about when he thinks about you? Because Jesus is trying to really clarify that even in the brokenness, even in the darkness, this is God's perspective towards you. It's the perspective of a Father who loves you and has compassion. I don't know if you've been following the news, but recently Billy Graham passed away. Billy Graham is like the world's most famous evangelist. And in college, he was just a hero of mine and my roommate's. True story, on Thursday night, we would have roommate nights, and we would swing by the cafeteria in our college and get Chick-fil-A, because I went to a Christian college, and we had Chick-fil-A in the cafeteria, called it the Promised Land. So Chick-fil-A, and all the roommates met back in the room, and we would sit every Thursday, and we would eat Chick-fil-A and watch reruns of the Billy Graham Crusade. Every Thursday night, we got saved again. We rededicated our life to Christ again. Every Thursday night, you're like, oh, I'm a Christian again. And one of my roommates had worked a Billy Graham event, and on the way out, he saw a life-size cutout, a cardboard cutout of Billy Graham. He's like, hey, can I have this? And they're like, oh, that's weird, but sure. And so he took it, and in our dorm room for 3 years was a life-size cutout of Billy Graham. And he's like holding the Bible like this, and so we would like give him a high five on the way to class every single day. Billy Graham was our boy. And he passed away recently, and so I was live streaming his funeral. I wanted to see what people were saying about him. And his kids got up, and they shared story after story. And one of his daughters, named Ruth, got up to talk about her dad. And she said, everyone has a Billy Graham story. Here's my Billy Graham story. She said, I was married to a man for 21 years. And after 21 years, we got a divorce. And she said there was shame on both sides, brokenness, and lots of sin and issues. And after 21 years, we got divorced. And so she said I had to move away from where I lived. And so I moved to a new location, got involved in a new church. And I started dating a new guy really fast. And we were dating fast and furious. And my mom called me and said, hey, you should slow down. We'd love to meet this guy. But I didn't want to listen to my mom. So my dad calls me from Tokyo. And he's like, hey, you should slow down. We want to meet this guy and make sure things are going well. Like, you don't have to be in a hurry. And she didn't listen to either her mom or her dad. And on New Year's Eve, she married this guy. And she realized within 24 hours, she had made a terrible decision. And within 5 months into her new marriage, she eventually had to flee her marriage because of the fear she had of this man. And when she fled her marriage, she thought to herself, where can I go? And she said, I have to go to my dad's house. But where she lived to Billy Graham's house was like 2-day drive. So she drove for 2 days to get to her father's house. And they live on the side of a mountain, so you have to take all these switchbacks to get there. And she had been rehearsing the speech over and over in her head. Dad, I'm sorry, I've embarrassed you. I've disowned the family name. I recognize what I've done wrong. If you don't want me to be a part of things or don't go to events or whatever, like I understand. And she had rehearsed this speech over and over in her head. And she tells the story and she says, as a little girl, you know that you don't want to embarrass your father. That's a big deal. She's like, but when your father's Billy Graham, it's even more scary because you don't want to embarrass Billy Graham. And so she's driving and she's going through these switchbacks. She's about to be to her house. And when she takes the last turn, she sees that her dad is waiting outside the driveway for her. And so she pulls up and her dad stops the car and she gets out and she wants to rehearse. She wants to give the speech that she's rehearsed. And before she could say anything, her dad just gave her a huge hug and just held her. And he just said, welcome home. And so she's crying and he's crying. And here's what she said at his funeral. She said this. She said, there was no shame in his voice, no blame, no condemnation, no working to reinstate myself. There was simply unconditional love. And she said, my father was not God, but he showed me what God was like that day. And when we come to God with our sin, our brokenness, our failure, our pain, and our hurt, our Heavenly Father responds, welcome home. Do you believe that's what God thinks about when God thinks about you? The difficulty with this story is that most people believe it's the story of the prodigal son, and that's where the story ends. But this parable is actually the parable of two sons. One of the sons is the prodigal, and then there's this older brother who in verse 25, we get introduced to him. And meanwhile, the older brother was in the field working, and when he returned, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants what was going on. Your brother is back, he was told. And your father has killed the fattened calf, and we are celebrating because of his safe return. And you would think this is great news. Like your younger brother was gone, he's back. You're in the field, but now you're out of the field. So come on, let's go party. Your younger brother is back. An older brother would respond in this way, but in verse 28, you would think it would read like this. And the older brother was stoked, and he ran into the house, and he partied with the younger brother because finally they were back in their father's presence, and all the grace that the father had given him was amazing and reconciled the whole family, and that's the end of the story. No, the older brother was angry, and he wouldn't go in. So his father came outside and begged him, but he replied, all these years I have slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing that you told me. And in all that time, you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours, he's not even my brother anymore, when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf. But his father said to him, look, dear son, you've always stayed with me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found. Now again, the crowd understands, okay, the prodigal son, that's the sinners and tax collectors. The older brother, that's the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. So they had to understand what was happening in the story is who they are and the polarization of the characters. But this is the moment where you see what Jesus is trying to communicate to both sides. This is the moment. The sad point of this parable is that both sons are alienated from the Father's heart. The sad reality of this parable is that the prodigal son and the older son, they are both alienated. The younger brother wanted the father's money. He didn't want the father. The older brother wanted the father's money. He didn't even actually want the father. The younger brother goes about getting the money by being really, really, really bad. The older brother is going about getting the money by being really, really, really good. And so they're both in very different places in the story. And here's the part you can't miss. That you can be lost by breaking the rules, or you can be lost by keeping the rules. You can be lost by breaking the rules, or you can be lost by keeping the rules. Both ways are avenues of being your own God. And the scandal of this story is at the end, the bad boy is saved and the good boy is lost. That is the scandal of the story. And the older brother in the story, he is lost not in spite of his goodness, but because of his goodness. So another way to say this is that because he thought he was good enough, he never recognized the goodness of the Father. He was working all along to get himself there, and he never saw what was always offered to him in the first place. So many people think that religion is about morality versus immorality, or about being good versus being bad. And the gospel in all reality is something altogether different. It's not morality, immorality, good or bad. It's an altogether different story because it's a transformation of your heart that then leads to a transformation of your actions. And so what you see in religion is this equation relationship with God that says, I obey, therefore I'm accepted. But the gospel comes along and says, no, you're accepted, therefore obey. But so many people think, no, I gotta do all the right stuff and then God's gonna accept me and he's gonna accept me because I did all the right stuff. But Jesus is like, no, listen, before the prodigal son did anything, he was accepted, and because he was accepted, therefore he obeyed. But again, the religious mindset is that we're going to give God a righteous record. We're going to do the work. We're going to make it happen. We're going to be good enough. We're going to be moral enough. We're going to give God a righteous record. And then because we offer that to God, now he owes us. God, I don't know if you saw my life, but I never have that bad day where I eat calzones for breakfast. I only have awesome days. Therefore, you owe me, God. My righteousness is a gift to you, God. When the gospel is that your righteousness is not a gift from you, it is a gift to you. That Jesus has done something on your behalf, therefore God gave me a righteous record. Now I live for him out of joy because something has been done on my behalf that I could have never done. The elder brother obeys to get stuff from God. And this is the trickiest, most subtle nuance of all things religious, where so many people say, I obey to get things from God. Heaven, blessing, prosperity, whatever you want to put in the blank, I obey to get stuff from God. When the gospel teaches you You don't obey to get stuff from God. The point of the gospel is not to get stuff from God. The point of the gospel is to get God. Both of the sons were after the father's stuff, when the moral of the parable is that the Father is the gospel. The Father is the good news. The Father's the one they should have longed to be with the entire time. But they miss this. The older brother misses it because he's self-righteous, so he's looking down on the younger brother thinking, I've done all these things right and you haven't done anything right. So self-righteous people, what's crazy is externally they're incredibly judgmental and internally they're freakishly insecure because they never know if they're doing enough. So they look around, they judge everybody because they're moral and they don't have bad days, but inside they're insecure because they don't know if they've done enough. And then people who are the younger brother, they know that they've sinned and they've done bad things, and so they think, I could never come to God, because if I come to God, I got to get moral, I got to get my act together, I got to do all this stuff to come to God. And that is the tragedy of so many stories in the church, where you have friends and you're like, hey, come to church with me. And they're like, no, I could never go to church, like I've done too many bad things. And you're like a really good person, like you don't have bad days. And people, like younger brother kind of people, never get to see the heart of the Father because older brother kind of people continually get in the way. And they don't come to the party and celebrate. They come to the party and get judgmental and self-righteous and uppity. And Jesus goes, listen, the moral of the story is that both of you are off. Both of you are absolutely alienated from the Father. But the good news is the Father pursues you no matter where you find yourself. So again, I ask you, what do you think God thinks about you? Because the answer is, God recognizes your brokenness and your need, and he responds to you with love and compassion. And God created a world, we have this equation relationship with God, but God created a world where the equation was built around the fact that doing, performing, accomplishing, this whole concept was completely taken off the table. God wanted a relationship with you that had nothing to do with your performance and nothing to do with your goodness. God loved you so much, he took do off the table. He loved you so much, and he had so much compassion for you that you no longer have to do anything to get his approval. Therefore, the gospel is not a list of things you do, but rather, it's a once and for all declaration of what's been done. It's a once and for all declaration of what's been done. Jesus' life, death, resurrection in our place has been done. Therefore, don't you dare try to do something that's already been done on your behalf. You spend your whole life trying to accomplish something that's already yours. You spend your whole life trying to do something that's already been done in your place. So you ask yourself, what must I do to be saved? What must I do to come to the Father? And what's beautiful about this story is the answer is come home. What must I do to be saved? Wake up to the fact that you're living in a pig pen and come home. Wake up to the fact that all around you are things that don't satisfy and come home. You're hungry for something you're never going to find there. You're thirsty for something that's never going to be found there, so come home. And in this story, it's like a literal pig pen that this guy's trying to eat out of. And I think in our story, in the collegiate world, in the American world, unfortunately, it's not a dirty pig pen like that. It's an actual, really nice pig pen. And it's a really nice place or a nice house with a nice job and a lot of security and a lot of comfort. And the reality is, you've got to wake up to see that that doesn't satisfy. And you've got to wake up to see that your Father is better than that thing. And so the son is in the pig pen and he recognizes, man, my Father is better than this. I got to go home. And one day you'll look around at the success or whatever story you're chasing after, and one day, by the grace of God, you will wake up and you'll say, man, my Father's better than this. And the remainder of the New Testament teaches that in that moment of awakening, the younger son couldn't even do that himself. Even the father had to awaken his heart to the fact that the Father was better. So somehow in the story, even though the father's like on the front porch waiting, the Father is also the one that awakens the son's heart to even realize he's better. So be awakened to the fact that what you were pursuing is not going to satisfy, and go back to the Father. Kill your pride and go home. Kill your pride and go home. And some of you say, no, I've run too far. I've done too many bad things. And this is something we don't talk about very often. But the reason why Jesus and God had to take do off the table, you doing, you accomplishing, you achieving, the reason they had to take that off of the table is because this relationship we have in this world with God is not just being held down by the fact that you do good or do bad. There's actually an unseen spiritual power called sin and death that you could never overcome. There's an unseen spiritual power that you could never overcome. And so God had to send forth Jesus in your place to overcome that so that there could be an opportunity for your heart to be awakened to go to God. And this is what you have to recognize, that there is an unseen force holding you down, beating you up that would never be overcome by you. It needed another one who was more powerful to overcome that even in the first place. In Tim Keller's book, Prodigal God, he says that everyone in the crowd listening to the story would have understood something that we don't understand as Westerners. In this story and in that culture, the older brother in the story had a moral responsibility to leave his father's house and chase down the younger brother and bring him home. That's an understanding in the culture that everybody listening to the story would have been thinking to themselves, how come the older brother doesn't go get the younger brother? That's what has to happen. The older brother should go to the father and say, hey, Father, I need to go get my younger brother. He hasn't come home yet, and it's my responsibility to go get him. Everybody in that culture would have been asking, where's the older brother? Why didn't the older brother go get him? What's going on in the story? And Tim Keller, in his brilliance, said, the beauty of the prodigal son story, or the parable of the two sons, is that Jesus is not just telling the story. He's also showing the fact that he is the true older brother who has come to get the wayward sons. And there's a wayward son in a pig pen, and there's a wayward son working in the field. And the true older brother is here saying, hey, my father's throwing a party, and you're both invited. I have come here to overcome the spiritual power that you could never overcome, and I've come here to invite you into the party. But you've got to kill your pride, and you've got to come home. And I'm here as the true older brother giving you that invitation. Will you come home? And the only way you can come home is by recognizing what's been done on your behalf and receiving that as the good news that it is. It's a proclamation of what's been done. You know, history records Buddha's final words. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the great spiritual leader and thinker, his final words, his dying words were, strive without ceasing. Keep working hard, keep trying to figure it out, keep working for your salvation, keep earning, keep achieving, keep going for it. This treadmill spirituality, Buddha's dying words are strive without ceasing. And then you have Jesus, living a life we couldn't live, going to the cross in our place, and his final words are, it is finished. Fundamentally different picture. Strive without ceasing, do whatever you can do to achieve your salvation, or no, go to the one who says, I've accomplished it all on your behalf, and I'm inviting you to believe that to be true. So what do you think about when you think about what God thinks about you? What do you think about when you think about what God thinks about you? Do you think he thinks you're a failure? You're just going to mess up again. You're going to keep sinning. You're going to keep doing your thing. Or do you think this? And this is Jesus' way of trying to settle the story. When God thinks about you, he thinks of you as his child, who he loves, who he created, who he has purpose for, who he has dreams for. He thinks about you as his child. And even in the most broken moments of your life, he looks on you and he has love and he has compassion. And he is perpetually waiting on the porch for you to come home. He will run out and greet you. He will hug you, he will kiss you, he will overwhelm you. And Jesus goes, is that a clear enough picture for all of us to stop creating images of what we think about when we think about God? You have messed up, everyone's messed up. Come home and the Father will tackle you before you get there. Do you understand now? Yet still, none of us can believe that to be true. And the only way you can believe it to be true is testing him. Next time you sin, next time you fail, run to the Father and let him lavish his love on you. Let him meet you with love. Let him meet you with compassion. And that moment will stir in you a passion for obedience and a hatred towards that sin you committed. It's not beating yourself up and then trying hard and going, okay, God, I'm going to have 3 good days, then I'll pray again. That's not going to work. And by the way, you've tried it and it didn't work then, did it? No. How about this? Run to the Father. Let him lavish his love on you. And somewhere in that moment of him lavishing your love on you, you will be transformed to hate that sin and love obedience. But it's not by trying harder. It's by going to the Father and letting him lavish his love on you. God thinks you're his child. He knows there's sin. He knows there's brokenness. But the invitation stands. Come home. And what's beautiful about that invitation is it's not just for people who don't believe. It's for people who believe. It's an invitation for every single day of your life. That's the good news of the gospel, is that it never gets old and never goes away.